This lecture deals with the civil rights movement that kind of picks up really in the 1950s. We will talk about it again in the 60s, which is more commonly referred to as the civil rights movement. But it really picks up in the 1950s, and this set of statistics kind of shows you why. Between 1882 and the post-Reconstruction era that ends in 1877, in 1968, there are a total of 4,742 lynchings in the United States. 90% of the victims were Southern, so it's happening mostly in the South. 73% of them were black, majority African American, and there were 27% who were white. Those who were white and lynched were most likely to be supporters of the civil rights movement and trying to protect African Americans and their rights. So you see that there's different methods or different areas are lynching more, but the majority of them, where it's 200 or more, those brown states are most of the former Confederacy. As you move west and as you move north, there are less. They still exist, but they are less. And again, most of them are African American, but you can see as we approach the 1920s and later on, those statistics drop for each group, but mostly for white people. So there are obviously some civil rights successes in kind of that period 7, early period 8 period that we're in. After World War II, the civil rights movement begins to gain momentum. There's the Tuskegee Airmen who serve in World War II, and just like after World War I, African Americans serve and try to promote democracy outside of the United States. But when they get back, they feel that they're not getting that same democracy and same equality that they're granting to other countries. So in 1954, Rosa Parks is one of many people who go out and do their bus protest, where they sit in the front of the bus where African Americans are not supposed to sit. They're supposed to give up their seats to white people in the front of the bus at least, and it causes the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1954, eventually the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which said you could segregate public facilities as long as they were equal, is overturned by Brown versus Board of Education. In 1954, we also see Martin Luther King Jr. become a major national civil rights leader, kind of during that Montgomery bus boycott. And in 1958, the Little Rock Nine entered the Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. So you can see a lot of these events are really happening in the early to mid-50s and not so much in the 60s as most Americans think. So the famous story of Rosa Parks and her arrest is, significant to the civil rights movement for what it symbolizes and what it means. Now, she is not the first to do this. There was a woman named Claudette Colvin who does this earlier in the 1950s. But Rosa Parks is better known because there's more of an impact for when she is arrested. So she refuses to give her seat in the front of a bus to a white man. She is eventually arrested and charged with violation of the segregation law in Montgomery City Code, so it's in Montgomery, Alabama. 50 African-American leaders in the community met to discuss what to do about Rosa's arrest. And they look to this, just this picture and think, how can we use this? There's a relatively, middle-aged woman who is pushing for her rights, and all she wants to do is sit down. It's December, it's relatively cold, she's been working all day. How can we use this? And she says, people always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. That isn't true. I was tired. I was not tired physically or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in, so she decides to fight. Again, she's not going to physically fight because she's going to be in line with Martin Luther King Jr. and it uses civil unrest to show the horrors of the Jim Crow laws and the South, and just how ridiculous it is that a middle-aged woman cannot, take a seat on a bus because of the color of her skin. So the reaction to this is African Americans in Montgomery begin to boycott buses. 40,000 black commuters walk to work some as far as 20 miles rather than go on these buses, and 40,000 people not on buses, not buying tickets, is a large loss to the bus company. The bus boycott lasts more than a year, and as the company's finances struggle, eventually they called for segregation on buses to be finally destroyed. Now that's only on buses, but you're seeing that this method of nonviolent protest, and especially economic protest, as African Americans are using some of their economic might that we're seeing in the 50s, where everybody is getting a better standard of living and more money, that they're using that to gain some more rights. One of the other galvanizing or bringing together events of the 1950s is around the same time with the murder of a young man named Emmett Till. Emmett Till is a 14-year-old boy who was visiting his cousin in Money, Mississippi, and he is accused of a couple of things, whether he whistled at a white woman or said, "Hey, baby," in the grocery store. Eventually, the woman's husband and his brother-in-law come and to Emmett Till's uncle's home, request the boy, say, "We're not going to hurt him, but we need to teach him a lesson about how he speaks to women." He is eventually murdered, lynched by two white men, J.M. Millam and Roy Bryant, that evening. They are eventually arrested, but the people are eventually acquitted by a white jury. In 2004, they actually reopened the trial based on new evidence and suggested that more people may have been involved. But we basically know that those two gentlemen at least had committed this crime of a 14-year-old boy who was alleged to have whistled at a woman. And this is a very galvanizing event for the civil rights movement because this is a young, good-looking kid. So it's a kid from the North who goes south, doesn't know the rules of the South, and eventually loses his life because of it. So to use this for something, for some good or some movement to come out of Emmett Till's murder, his mother has Jet Magazine published the image of Till's mutilated body. At his funeral, they had a open casket. Now, I'm going to show the image right now. I will show it for about 5 seconds. So if you are in any way uncomfortable with kind of gruesome images, you can skip ahead for about 10 seconds. So we see as the Montgomery bus boycott is going on, and Emmett Till's murder, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is Martin Luther King's organization, starts to push, President Eisenhower starts to do some things for civil rights. So he creates the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which created the United States Civil Rights Commission, investigated and reported voter discrimination, whether it be literacy tests or whatever. It also gave the Attorney General the power to require federal courts to issue orders to prevent any interference with a person's right to vote. So we're starting to gain that protection for African Americans. In 1960, before he leaves office, Eisenhower signs the Civil Rights Act of 1960, and he creates federal voting referees who helped correct conditions to prevent voter discrimination. So we're recognizing that there is a problem. Even though African American men, and now women as of the 19th Amendment, have the right to vote, there are laws in states that are stopping those federal pieces of legislation, 19th and 15th Amendments, from being enacted, and Eisenhower is stepping in. So we get this new person, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the world stage and on the national stage. So he has a PhD in theology. In 1953, at the age of 26, he becomes a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, and his start as a civil rights leader came during that Montgomery bus boycott of Rosa Parks. He starts to gain some momentum, and we start to see some wins with the Montgomery bus boycott being lifted, or the segregation being lifted. We start to push with Emmett Till's murder, and we start to see some legislation being passed to strengthen the enforcement of that 15th and 19th Amendment to allow some voting rights to actually be practiced. So we're seeing some wins for African Americans using that civil disobedience. So about 2 years later, he forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that's important to realize that every civil rights movement we've talked about, whether it be abolition or slave revolts in the 1700s and 1800s, or modern civil rights, they're mostly based around some sort of religion, and Martin Luther King is no different. So they use churches to organize nonviolent protests. That's a lot where the nonviolence comes from. They use Gandhi's philosophy of civil disobedience. It kind of worked in India, and we've seen it work in America. And it leads to media coverage for the daily inequities suffered by Southern blacks, and they start to look as victims. They don't want to look constantly as victims because they're kind of making this happen, but it draws some support from Northerners as they're seeing the horrors that these people live through on a daily basis. It kind of goes back to that Uncle Tom's Cabin thing in the 1850s, same type of idea. So now with television, they televise segregation violence, led to mass public sympathy. The civil rights movement becomes more important as a political topic during the early 60s, but we see, again, a lot of movement in the 1950s as part of the civil rights movement.